Margaret Thatcher, she left power 35 years ago. She has had a lasting influence on this country in many, many ways, but not all bad. Labour governments haven't rolled back virtually any of her legislation on trade unions, on the economy. There is an economic settlement that effectively she invented. And if it was so terrible, why didn't Blair or Brown do anything about it?
Iain Dale, welcome to PoliticsJOE.
Delighted to be here.
We are delighted to have you here. Before we start, we're going to talk about your book, Margaret Thatcher. But before we do...
Don't say like that.
Sorry, I need to go and wash my mouth out with soap now, Iain. How would you like to introduce yourself?
Broadcaster, political geek.
Yeah.
I think that's probably about it. Serial editor and writer of books.
More than 30, I believe.
60, actually.
Very good.
But most of them I've edited, which is a bit of a cheat. But
Yeah,
this one I've written every word.
And it's quite good as well, it has to be said. There's an endorsement there. I'm not sure I'll make it to the front cover. Look, you're also the author of a recent Telegraph column headlined, "Left-wing haters need a lesson in Thatcherism."
I didn't write the headline.
Well, regardless, school is now in session, so you can start to give me a lesson. Look, let's start with intent,
Yep.
right? This book, its stated aim, right, is to kind of reintroduce Thatcher to a generation of people who actually don't have any lived experience of what she was like as Prime Minister. I mean, when there's a line that's in the book in the promotional material that essentially anyone who's younger than 53, is that right, has never had the opportunity to vote for her. And when you see it on the page, you go, oh my goodness, there's actually like a real sense of time and distance. Yeah,
well, if you voted for her in 1987, you would have had to have been born before June 1969. So I'm trying to do, I think it's more than 53.
Yeah, it would be now. Yeah.
And if you were born after she left power, you're now 35.
Wow.
So I don't know what percentage of the population that covers, but it's a huge percentage. And she, I think, was one of the two most significant post-war prime ministers, maybe three, Attlee, Thatcher, and possibly Blair, I would say. She changed the political weather. Tony Benn always used to divide people into weather vanes and signposts. Well, she was a weather vane. She knew where she was heading. She wasn't a kind of Starmer politician who decides to sort of do that, see which way the wind is blowing.
No, I don't. Yeah, he's written a couple of times, hasn't he, about his admiration of Margaret Thatcher. And it scans because you go, I could see what you admire about her, the fact that she had some convictions.
Yeah.
Why do you think now is the right moment to reassess her? And possibly why in a sympathetic light?
People love anniversaries. 50 years ago in February, she was elected leader of the Conservative Party. And I think that, I don't know if you want to come on to this later, but I think there are some parallels to her difficulties as leader of the opposition and Kemi Badenoch's. It's the centenary of her birth in October, so there's a lot of Thatcher going on this year. So Swift, who publish it, they're doing a series of books on different prime ministers. And so Alan Johnson has written one on Harold Wilson. Steve Richards is doing one on Tony Blair, that's coming out in September. And they're all quite short. Now, they said to me, can you do 30,000 words? And I said, that's not a book, that's a pamphlet. But of course, I mean, this narrative that today's generation have the attention span of a flea, which I think is a lazy characterisation.
I agree.
But on the other hand, you're a political geek, but I doubt whether even you would want to read 3,000 words of Charles Moore's 3-volume biography of Margaret Thatcher. But I would highly recommend that you do, because it is brilliant. I mean, it is the Robert Currow of British politics. But its stated aim is to introduce her to a new generation and maybe bust some of the myths that have grown up about her.
So tell me, I mean, the way you write about her, there's a lot of admiration. You don't shy away from her flaws either. Was there anything in the process of putting the book together that shifted your view of Thatcher or made you reconsider any of, well, I don't know, maybe perhaps myths that you believed before it came to writing it?
I think the one thing that I probably did discover in the writing of the book was that she delighted in her reputation as a conviction politician, somebody who knew her own mind, knew what she wanted to achieve and knew how she was going to achieve it. But every chapter there's some example of where she was actually quite pragmatic and didn't go like a bull in a china shop. Trade union reform is a good example of this, where I mean, that was really how I kind of became a supporter of hers in the late 1970s. I was late teenager, and the country was in a state because of the number of strikes, because of the way people perceive the unions essentially controlling the government, which nowadays we find that quite difficult to imagine. But it really was the case. The Prime Minister of the day, James Callaghan, he could literally not lift a finger without the head of the TUC, Len Murray, saying, yeah, that's fine. Now, you translate that to today, most people listening to or watching this are not going to be able to name the head of the TUC.
I was going to say, I think Paul Novak probably quite fancy having that kind of power.
I'm sure he would. But it was a totally different time. And I can remember, and it must have been, I think, the 1978 Conservative Party conference when I would have been 16. And I was a Liberal Party member at that point. I mean, very sad to even join the Liberal Party at that point, but I did. And I remember watching this speech, and I just thought, well, she's identified what all the problems are, and she's come up with the solutions, or potential solutions. And that really got me interested in her as a politician. And so if we go into the period when she was in power, she didn't introduce massive trade union reforms immediately. It was very much slowly catchy monkey. She appointed James Pryor as Employment Secretary. Now, he was a sort of ruddy-faced Suffolk farmer. He was a consensual politician. He wasn't somebody looking for a confrontation. And so I think there were 2 employment acts published when he was Secretary of State. And they sort of tinkered at the edges. They looked at the closed shop and all sorts of other sort of restrictive practices. But it wasn't a bull in a china shop approach. And she knew that there would be a confrontation with the miners at some point. I mean, it's clear as night followed day, particularly when Arthur Scargill replaced Joe Gormley as the leader of the NUM. And she appointed Nigel Lawson to be Energy Secretary in 1981. And he then started building up supplies of coal for whenever the confrontation would come. And I genuinely believe that they weren't planning a confrontation, but they knew that there would be one from the NUM at some point. And sure enough, as night follows day, that did come. There was one point in 1981 where they actually gave in to a massive pay demand from the NUM because they knew they weren't ready for a big strike. But come 1984, Arthur Scargill knew that secondary picketing would be banned in the next Employment Act, which would come into force, I think, in 1985. So he knew that if they didn't get in soon, they wouldn't be able to conduct a dispute in the way that they normally would. And he made the big mistake of not holding a strike ballot, which split the miners not down the middle, but there was a significant number who were so angry about that. So the Union of Democratic Mine Workers was formed. And, well, we know what happened then. And it was an absolutely vicious dispute on both sides. And Margaret Thatcher did deploy the police in a way that had never been done before in an industrial dispute, but it was one that she could not afford to lose. And when it did finish, like literally a year after it started, I think that was the sign that that was the end of union power. Mm. And I mean, it's not as if there weren't any more strikes doing it, but if you look at, I mean, I detail the number of days that were lost to strike action throughout all of her period in power. And obviously 1985 would have been sort of like the top, and then it just went like that, if you draw a graph. But there was a lot of pragmatism involved in the general attitude to that. And if you look at a lot of her approaches on foreign policy, on social policy, that's very rare where there was a radical departure. And where there was a radical departure, it was almost by accident. Privatisation, for example. I mean, there was some words in the 79 manifesto using the word denationalisation, but it was all a bit half-hearted. And it was really only when like British Airways and a couple of other British Telecom were privatised that it really caught on, and the general public really bought into it. I mean, ordinary people for the first time could buy shares.
TV ads, right? Yeah.
And they did in their millions. Now, they sold them again pretty quickly, it has to be said, to make a profit. But that's capitalism at work. But I think, again, it's difficult to remember those times. And you're right, British Gas, when that was privatised, Tell Sid was the slogan.
I was trying to remember the name.
And it was a brilliant marketing effort.
Yeah.
And there are all sorts of other examples of her pragmatism. So going back to your original question, I mean, that was the one thing that maybe I discovered that I hadn't really clocked onto.
Interesting. Oh, just a sort of tangential point. It's really interesting here, that perspective on balloting for strike action, because a lot of trade union members, general secretaries now would say that they view the legislative requirements around balloting for strike action every 6 months, having to renew your mandate, certain levels of turnout required. They find that to be punitive and restrictive, but it's actually quite interesting that, you know, if, let's say, Scargill had actually been by law required to hold a mandate, alternate view of history, what would have happened? Now, I want to move things on. We'll sort of take it thematically, and I think all of our conversation really is hindsight's 2020, and a lot of the criticism I think that I am going to level at her is one that is, you know, 30, 40 years down the line, and we can see the consequences of certain pieces of action.
But before you do that, can I just go back to your first question about how the book came about?
Yeah.
Because I wasn't sure how to theme it, and it was only when a couple of years ago I broke my hip. Happens to you when you get as old as me. And I was advised I should get a personal trainer, which I always think is a bit wanky when you sort of say, oh, I've got a personal trainer. Anyway, I went down to my local gym and met Aaron, who at that point was 25 years old. So I told him that I was a radio presenter, talked about politics a lot. And his first thing that he said to me says, now, Margaret Thatcher, I've heard of her, but what does she do? He didn't even know that she had been Prime Minister. And I was like really horrified by this. And then I thought, he's an intelligent guy. If he doesn't know this, there'll be loads and loads of other people that don't know this. Now, you've got the type of audience that would know that from a younger generation, but your audience will have loads and loads of friends who are Aaron's. And so I thought, well, I'm going to aim this at him and try and introduce her to this new generation who have grown up with the myths promulgated by, as I say in that Telegraph article, by the unthinking liberal left, that all of the problems that this country has now are down to her. Now, she left power 35 years ago. It's like I was writing this book in 1925 and was writing about Disraeli. And you think, okay, I believe, and I say in the book, she has had a lasting influence on this country in many, many ways, but not all bad. I mean, look, and you think, well, Labour governments haven't rolled back virtually any of her legislation on trade unions, on the economy. There is an economic settlement that effectively she invented. And if it was so terrible, why didn't Blair or Brown do anything about it? I mean, Starmer is tinkering at the edges of sort of employment law, fine, but that's about it, tinkering at the edges. So, yes, I acknowledge her failures. And I mean, I don't know if you want to talk about the council house sales, but I think that is both a huge success, but also a failure for all sorts of different reasons.
You clearly, Iain, have interviewed people before because you anticipated what we're about to talk about. Look, I think we will come to that sort of explosion of the Keynesian consensus and replacing it with Thatcherism, neoliberalism, Blair being her proudest achievement. You know, we'll come to all of that later on. Let's do council housing, right? Because, you know, you characterise it in this book as empowering, revolutionary, and, you know, I wouldn't dispute any of those things. I think the prospect of home ownership for a generation of people that never had it on their horizon absolutely, well, it revolutionised British politics. Yeah, absolutely was. And it's kind of my point about hindsight, right, where we sit now, and particularly for our audience, younger people, in the middle of a housing crisis. You know, the average age of sort of first-time buyer now, I believe, is 37. About, I think it was 40 years ago now, the typical arrangement at home for a person 30 years old was in a relationship with children, and now it's living at home with their parents. Rents are spiralling, and a lot of people point back to this moment in time. Right to buy comes in, and for a number of reasons, which I'm sure we're about to speak about, the stock does not get replenished. So,
well, let me stop you there on that point.
Okay.
Because if you think about it logically, the stock not being replenished, in a sense, shouldn't have mattered, because you still had the same number of houses, you still had the same number of people. It wasn't as if there was an extra million people that had to be housed because council houses are sold. what the problem with it was that
I was about to say, after Boris Johnson got his hands on power, actually there are a million more people in the country now, but yeah.
Well, there are, and again, we can go into that because immigration in those years was very, very low.
Yeah.
So that's had a huge impact on it. And I'm somebody who thinks immigration is by and large a good thing. But what they didn't do was replenish council housing stock so people from similar backgrounds could actually get a house. And so the system was that councils were allowed to keep 25% of the proceeds of sale of council houses. And many councils didn't actually use that money to build new council houses. So at the beginning of Thatcher's period in power, there were 100,000 new builds a year in council houses. By the end, it was 8,000. Now, you don't have to be Einstein to work out that there's going to be a few social issues resulting from that. So I think that was a failure of policy. And it was partly, I think it was overtly political, because in those years, people who were the so-called C's and D's, working class people, generally voted Labour. So if you're a sort of ultra conservative, you think, well, why do you want to build more council houses? All we're doing is encouraging more Labour voters. But they very soon worked out that that was not the case. You look at the percentage of working class people who voted Conservative in 79 and then again in 83. And I would argue that the 92 Conservative victory was still down to the sale of council houses. They were getting 40, 45, 50% in some constituencies of the working class vote. Boris Johnson is the only Conservative leader to have matched that. He got 47.5 in 2019. So this whole new generation of Conservative voters were born, and it then trickled down to their children as well, because they said, well, Margaret Thatcher gave us a chance to own our home. And housing estates all over the country were transformed. In 1983, when I was at university in Norwich, I was responsible for running the Tory campaign in the so-called roughest council estate in Norwich. And I literally knocked on every door 2 or 3 times during that campaign. And I can still remember being at the count and watching the ballot boxes being opened from that estate with the Tory candidate who then became the MP next to me. And it was like sort of, I couldn't believe the number of Conservative votes there were. And it was entirely down to that. Well, I say it's entirely down to that. I think those people also voted for her because they did see her as a strong leader of convictions. They might not agree with everything that she wanted to do, but they looked at the alternative and thought, I don't think so. And this is where you can translate it to today, where we're building a generation of people now who think the Tories were incompetent in office. After 11 months, they've given up on Labour.
Yep.
This is manna from heaven for Nigel Farage. And you see that in the younger demographic particularly, I think, who think, well, a plague on all of your houses. I may not agree with Nigel Farage on a lot of things, but at least he does what he says, or he means what he says. And that is quite a powerful thing for a politician. And so I'm slightly drifting off here, but I think that there is now a possibility of Farage becoming Prime Minister of this country, which I would have never thought possible in years.
Me either. The Westminster wisdom was always that there was essentially a ceiling on his support, right? 15, 20, 25% perhaps. And I think increasingly, it's not just happening here either. It's happened in America, and it's increasingly happening in Europe as well now, where call them what you want, populists, nationalists, far right the far right in some instances as well, that essentially over a period of time, and it has been a gradual process. So look, voters aren't, by default hateful people, but I think genuinely decades of kind of failed promises on issues as disparate as immigration, economic growth, take your pick, the sort of, you used to be able to talk about distrust. I think it's more than that now towards the political class.
No, it's just less trust.
Yeah, right. And so it's like, it's hate, it's contempt, and all of a sudden you have political actors, be they Trump, be they Farage, take your pick, where you go, actually, this guy hates the political system and the political system hates him. And I feel the same way. And that can be a really powerful political force. Let's rewind a little bit. A conscious political act, because if you want to talk about it in Marxist terms, and I've read plenty of people who criticise right to buy in this way, they essentially view it as a conscious choice by Thatcher to help people leave the working class, become part of the petty bourgeoisie, and therefore build a new electoral coalition that essentially hadn't been done before. Do you think it was that sort of self-aware and conscious, or do you think it was more of a kind of ideological decision?
Well, you see, the right is not particularly ideological. The left always has been, because it's got Marx and it's got all sorts of other people that it can pick bits from to be ideological. On the right, it's more difficult. Now, Thatcher, I mean, she would carry around a book by Hayek in her handbag, as we all would, I suppose.
I do too.
But I mean, there aren't that many people on the right that you have to pick from their ideology. So I don't believe this was a conscious decision in that way, because right to buy had existed before. I mean, it was around in the mid-1970s, and it was only really when councils like Norwich City Council prevented people from buying their houses. And that's when I think that's when the Conservatives saw this as a political opportunity.
A lot of that council housing stock now is owned by private landlords, whether it's buy-to-let mortgages or owned outright. And there's sort of a perverse situation, actually, where a lot of them are in receipt of housing benefit, paying off their buy-to-let mortgages, or actually, and this is an issue that I think hasn't had the full prominence that it is going to get, particularly in relation to local authority budgets, is temporary accommodation costs, right? And local authorities pouring money into housing, whether it's the homeless, vulnerable people, asylum seekers, take your pick. It's costing a huge amount of money. And so we kind of have this almost, I don't know how, it's sort of like welfare for rentier capitalism, right? And I wonder if Thatcher could have the foresight or saw that this is the sort of state of play that we would end up in, what her perspective on that would be. Would she view it as state welfare for private individuals? Would she view it as extractive rents? I don't know what your perspective on that. I'm asking you to speculate.
Well, it's really difficult, and there are so many other what-ifs surrounding her. That, I mean, would she have voted for Brexit? I mean, maybe we'll come on to that. She would not have foreseen the explosion in immigration since 2003. And I emphasise, I say this as somebody who's pro-immigration. I'm not somebody on the right who thinks immigration is a bad thing. But if you have high levels of immigration, you don't plan for it, and you don't provide the infrastructure, whether it's hospitals, schools, transport, whatever, or housing, don't be surprised if there are then very bad consequences from that. And you can't, some people say, oh yeah, but a lot of the immigrants, I mean, if they're coming from like Asia, they're used to having like 3 generations of families in one house, and Eastern Europeans, they don't mind sleeping 8 to a bedroom. Well, you can't run a society on that basis. I mean, we're not an Asian country, we're not an Eastern European country. And I think over the second half of the Labour government under Blair and Brown, and certainly in the 14 years of the Conservative government, nobody seemed to twig that eventually sort of the chickens would come home to roost. And even now, I don't think there is any acknowledgement by any party that this is an actual crisis. Or if they do acknowledge it, they've got no understanding of what needs to be done to solve this crisis. And again, that feeds into this discontent. And I don't, look, people who are anti-immigrant, you can characterise them as racist if you want, but it goes so much more deeper than that. Most people in this country are not racist. Most people in this country have no problem with immigration as long as it's at a level that can be managed.
I think actually quite often the political issue is that relentlessly and time again, the electorate has voted to reduce immigration, and particularly in relation to Boris Johnson, with circles in the right refer to it as the Boris wave, right? That close to 1 million people net come to the country. We've instructed you, we voted for you time and again, and it's actually the sort of the political class not listening to that electoral mandate that they have the biggest problem with.
And this largely emanates from the Brexit referendum, I think, where some politicians, including Nigel Farage, especially Nigel Farage probably, said, well, the country's full up. Well, it wasn't and isn't if you have the right infrastructure. 7% of the land of this country is built on, 7%. So I mean, it's a very easy argument to demolish. But when he put out that poster with this sort of queue of, I know, Albanians coming in or something.
Breaking point.
I mean, I thought, what an absolute disgrace. And he used to do the programme before me on LBC.
Yeah, I remember.
And the day that poster was released, I thought, you know what? I'm going to take him on that. So on our handover, and you know from your time on LBC, banter between presenters in the handover is not encouraged. And I remember going down to the studio a little early, and I just said to him at one point, I said, before we do our handover, Nigel, can I just ask you about this? And I laid into him. I said, it's an absolute disgrace. You should be ashamed of yourself for doing that. And I like Nigel Farage. I have a lot of time for him. I think he's an incredibly talented politician. But from time to time, he will do things or say things that appeal to the worst instincts of some of the electorate. And I find that unforgivable, whether it's him or some of the language that Robert Jenrick has been using of late. And I have no hesitation in taking them to task for it. But it all stemmed from then, when people thought that immigration would come down after Brexit. Well, not only did it not come down from outside Europe, it also, European citizens, well, everyone said, oh, they'll all go home. Well, some did. But if you look at the net migration figures from Europe, until I think last year, it was always positive. There were more people coming in than going back. So it's not surprising that people thought, oh, we've been betrayed. But I can remember during the Brexit referendum saying, anybody listen to this programme who thinks that immigration is going to go down, think again. Boy, was I right. I mean, I didn't expect it to go up to the levels it has. But in the end, the economy is what controls immigration. If you have a need, you're always going to get people who want to come here for obvious reasons. And if employers can't get staff from Britain, they will naturally look overseas for it.
Yeah, and I think, there is the obvious demographic question in this country. We have aging demographics. Our tax base will not be able to sustain the state pension at the level that it is right now, particularly if it's triple locked. Someone has to try and resolve that question. And it's, are you going to expand the working age population? Are you going to increase taxes? Are you going to reduce the state? It's unstoppable force meets immovable.
Well, the triple lock is just indefensible in my view. And I remember Kemi Badenoch last year came to do a phone-in on it. And she was like a central defender who has a brilliant game and then scores an own goal in the last minute.
Yeah.
And a caller came on and said, well, what can you offer me to show that you're thinking radically, that you're going to reform things? And she started talking about the triple lock. And I was thinking, I'm not sure you're wise to do this. And of course, Labour were on it within 5 minutes saying, well, we've guaranteed it. She's going to abolish it. I'm thinking, well, she's right to talk about it because it is illogical for it to continue. But it's electoral suicide when the older vote is actually the core vote. So, I mean, whether she'll go back to that, I don't know. But it's one of the few ways that you've got to actually reduce.
Yeah, point of difference, perhaps. And needs must. Okay, let's talk about economics, restructuring, possibly financialisation. We've touched on it already, and you're very clear in the book. She smashes the Keynesian consensus. And a left-wing critique would go that essentially what came in its place was a financialised services economy, unregulated.
What does that mean, financialised?
Well, financialised would be the sort of the transition of your economy towards speculation, asset bubbles, wealth generated by owning assets rather than necessarily sort of producing goods or producing goods, essentially.
Well, it was quite clear that the economy did transform. There was so much of our manufacturing industry that wasn't paying its way. Now, you can go on for years subsidising it. I mean, the car industry is a really good example here, where it was a basket case. Every British car manufacturer produced cars that no one wanted to buy. They were ugly, they were hideous, they were unreliable. The Morris Marina, I mean, go and look it up on Google. I mean, what an ugly car. The Austin Allegro, nobody wanted them. And in the end, and the unions had a sort of vice-like grip on the car industry, and they were so unreliable that if you bought one, you would never buy one again. You would then go to a foreign make. And so her argument was, well, okay, we're going to stop the subsidies to these industries. And they were costing billions a year. Not just the car industry, there are plenty of others as well. Shipbuilding, for example. I mean, why would you buy a ship built in Britain that was 3 times the cost of buying one elsewhere? I mean, how is that sustainable in the long term? So she did have an argument, a policy of, okay, well, let's let the market decide. And the British car industry in the short term was essentially eviscerated. And then Toyota came in, and then Nissan came in. And I mean, we apparently, I didn't know this, but we apparently now export more cars than any other country in Europe, including Germany. Now, that is some turnaround. But there were other industries, I mean, like the mines, for example, where a lot of the mines were becoming uneconomic. Now, you can argue, well, I mean, I remember learning in my A-level economics about the social cost of things. And if you let a particular mine or industry go, then you've got the social cost to pick up, because how do the people who work in that particular area find work? And I think that was a major failing of her government, where I think it was absolutely right to close uneconomic pits. But there were some villages where 100% of adult males worked down the pit. Now, I mean, what do you do in those circumstances? You have to provide some sort of alternative, even if it's only short term, whether it's retraining, whatever. And there wasn't, they did do some of that, but not enough. There was no, they didn't emphasize it enough as a priority. I don't think it was done through wicked me. I don't think they deliberately wanted people to become unemployed, because the unemployment figures were a constant sort of almost embarrassment to them. But there should have been more done to alleviate some of the problems that caused. And I mean, there were things where sort of call centres were encouraged to locate themselves in some of these areas, but it was all a bit tokenistic. And I think a lot more could have been done there. And she was the head of the government, and in the end, the buck stopped with her. And I don't think, I mean, she brought in Lord Young, who was had been head of the Manpower Services Commission, and she wanted him to really get to grips with this. And he did to an extent. And he was somebody she described as, well, other people bring me problems, he brings me solutions. So, I mean, he did start to turn things around, but it was a little bit too piecemeal.
Yeah, I do think, particularly from a left-wing perspective, you know, you cannot move for people mocking Trump and MAGA proponents when they talk about clean coal. You know, there is. I have no doubt in my mind that if coal mines and coal-powered power stations were running in this country, there would be left-wing opposition to their existence right now on climate grounds. Which,
exactly,
by the way, you write about Thatcher on climate, which is very interesting. But I think the issue is, as you've rightly identified, whether it's reskilling, and that could be in vocational training, it could be in anything else. Some people perhaps retiring, some people perhaps actually not being able to go and work and do anything else. And it is that kind of, I think, the sort of, you call it, quite brutal, actually, you know, let the market decide is essentially, you know, and the chips will fall where they may.
Yeah.
And I don't think now, certainly, I don't think, when we talk about the transition, green energy transition, and the words often used by the Labour Party is a just transition, right? That we're not going to leave communities behind. We're not going to leave people, if they are out of work or works in industries that we can't no longer support, that we will try to help them find work elsewhere. And I think that is probably the second part of the equation.
But
yeah, well, absolutely, yeah.
It's an easy thing to say.
Yeah, massively.
But it's actually a very difficult thing to implement. And I mean, the so-called sort of green revolution is great in some ways. Nobody is against us all becoming much greener and more environmentally friendly. But as you say, you could argue that she did the country a real favour by closing down all the coal mines. Because as you say, in 1989, she was the first world leader to make a speech on climate change. And if you read it, it really has stood the test of time. And she tried to get President Bush, the first Bush, on side on this and say, look, this is something that's going to hit us. America needs to play a role in this. She was saying that to a Houston oil man. So she never got anywhere with it. And then a year later, she was out of power. But again, this is one of those myths that people think, oh, she was just in it for the free market, that she was much more pragmatic than that. And the scientific training, she recognised there was a looming massive problem coming up. And I mean, I don't know, had she lived, whether she would have become one of the sort of vanguards of this or not. But she was the first.
Mm. It's funny, you jogged my talking about oil. You made me think about North Sea oil and gas, and the sort of the contrast between, particularly if you want to talk about sort of the Thatcherite economic thinking. there is a contrast to be drawn, isn't there, between Norway and Great Britain and the way that we've both deployed our access to those fossil fuels. I'm sure viewers will know Norway has this now colossal, I think like $1.7 trillion, I think, is the size of their national sovereign wealth fund as a result of revenues generated from their excavation of those fossil fuels.
The analogy I'm not sure works. It's an attractive analogy in many ways. And thinking, well, what would have happened if we had done that ourselves? But can you really compare Norway, a country of 5 million people, to a country of 60 or 70 million people with all of the sort of welfare system that we have? I mean, obviously Norway does too, to an extent, but I'm not sure that you can compare the two. But there's no doubt about it. Oil money was used to reduce public borrowing. Borrowing had been slightly out of control. Inflation was certainly out of control. 27% it reached at one point. And her mission in life was to control inflation, and everything was secondary to that. I mean, that didn't work out too well in the end, because by the time she left office, it had gone down to like 3 or 4%, but then was up again to 8 or 9. And the way to do that, she thought, was to grow the economy. And to do that, you needed to encourage entrepreneurs and deregulate. And she did both of those things. And you can look at all the statistics, and it was a strategy that worked. But as you say, there were many casualties along the way.
Let's talk about deregulation then. So 1986, Big Bang. Absolutely certain commentators, economic commentators, financial journalists will tell you that modernisation was much needed and obviously revolutionised not just our economy, but actually the global economy, really.
Well, the whole stock market had been basically ruled by establishment figures.
Yeah.
And that there was, and it was actually the ultimate closed shop. And that if you were sort of from Southend, you were never going to break that closed shop. And in I think it's 87, not 86, there was the so-called Big Bang, and it revolutionised the stock market. And yes, there was lots of deregulation. You can argue, well, did that go too far? You'd have to go to sort of specific sectors, I guess, to argue that one. But there was a real sense of can do, and this idea that, it was really wicked to create wealth had gone. And I mean, some of the comedy at the time was hilarious. You had Harry Enfield with his loads of money character, and you no longer had to feel ashamed if you were earning big money, because everyone else aspired to as well. And that's, I think, a mistake that the left often make, is that aspiration, although they mouth the word, they don't actually understand what it means. And aspiration means that just because somebody is earning £2 million, they shouldn't be taxed out of existence, because everyone would quite like to be earning £2 million. It doesn't mean to say everyone is totally materialistic, but everyone wants to do the best for their family. They want to have foreign holidays. They want to have a nice car. It's a perfectly natural thing to do. And if you're constantly told that, well, we're all going to hell in a handcart, which is what Starmer and Reeves have done in the first year of their government, then it starts to depress everyone else. It actually depresses economic growth rather than encourages it.
Yeah, I think aspiration can be an incredibly powerful political emotion, and I think Thatcher understood that. I think you write about her political instincts and how powerful and effective they were, and I just wonder whether or not, if we talk about deregulation of the financial sector, and then with hindsight you can talk about 2008 financial crash, how much of a connection is there between those two things? When we talk about social housing, right to buy, selling it off, and whether or not those instincts perhaps should have foreseen the potential negative consequences of some of the economic decisions that she made.
You can argue that, but the financial crash happened 18 years after she left office. Bill Clinton deregulated far more than President Bush had. Indeed, in some ways, more than Ronald Reagan had. Gordon Brown, I mean, we think back now, I think we sometimes have a false view of Gordon Brown, but he also followed a deregulation agenda for quite a long time as Chancellor. So yes, you can everyone, even 35 years on, lays the blame at her door for everything bad that happens now. And I'm sure there are things where you're right to do that, but you can't say it about everything. And I think this argument that, it's all down to the Big Bang, it's for the birds.
let's talk about her sort of rhetoric, and it connects to, I guess, those instincts. The lady's not for turning, famously, all of that. Do you think that kind of, well, we've spoken about her pragmatism already, so I'm hesitant to say stubbornness or dogma, but when you look at things like the poll tax or the European issue and her eventual demise, do you think the pragmatism that you've lauded so far in this interview, do you think that a little bit more of that could have changed her political fortunes? Do you think she was too dogmatic?
Well, on the poll tax, absolutely. I can remember being at, it must have been, I think it was probably the 88 Conservative Party conference, where there was a lot of pressure on the government to roll out the poll tax more quickly, because people forget, as I say, how hated the domestic rates were. And then they decided to do the worst thing and use Scotland as an experiment. And they were already really unpopular in Scotland. And so they rolled it out in Scotland a year before the rest of the country. And the Scots obviously thought that was an appalling thing to do. Now, if the poll tax had been, as it was originally meant to be, around £200 an adult, people would have still said it was unfair for a duke to pay the same as a dustman. That was the phrase. Refuse collectors, we must now say. But that was what everyone said at the time. And there was a certain element of truth in that. But when it got up to £400 or £500 for everybody, people thought, hang on a minute. And it's really difficult to understand how that was allowed to happen, because Nigel Lawson, who had been Chancellor since 1983, always thought that this was a mad idea. And normally, if the Chancellor thinks something's a mad idea, they veto it. The ministers that actually were responsible for implementing it, Kenneth Baker, William Waldegrave, Chris Patten, all dripping wets. I mean, Kenneth Baker sort of became the worm that turned in the end. But, I mean, all people who were actually opposed to her. You're thinking, well, didn't they see what the consequences of this was going to be? Well, clearly they didn't. So I think there was a certain amount of dogma there, and she thought that it would be too embarrassing to U-turn. I mean, there are other things she did U-turn on, so it wouldn't have been outrageous if she had. And she would probably have survived as Prime Minister if she had done that. The European issue is very different, I think, where she, because of the Iron Lady epithet that the Soviet newspaper gave her in 1977. Now, it's the best thing that could have happened to her. And she stood up, I think the week after that was said, she stood up at some Conservative fundraiser and said, "Here I am in my Red Star chiffon gown, the Iron Lady of the Western world. Well, I can be." And then she went on. And she revelled in that reputation, because there were still many people who doubted that a woman could do the job. And the day before the 79 election, the last Conservative broadcast was her just looking straight into the camera, saying, "Look, I get that a lot of you think a woman can't do the job. Let me just reassure you." And so it went on. And it was actually, I can't attribute the win to that, but I think it did play a part. So when it came to the European issue in the 1980s, when we were paying an outrageous sum to Brussels, because it was the budget contributions were all basically calculated to subsidise French farmers. And she thought, well, we're not one of the richest countries in Europe, and we weren't at the time if you looked at GDP. And she said, well, I want my money back. And she got it in the end. I mean, it's a very painful process. Every EEC summit was dominated by the British rebate. She got away in the end. And that led to her being perceived as much more anti-Europe than she actually was. So roll forward to 1988, and she made this speech in Bruges, which is probably one of the most famous speeches she ever made, because of one phrase. And that phrase was, "We haven't successfully rolled back the frontiers of the state in the UK to have them reimposed at a European level." Now, a statement of the bleeding obvious, I would have thought, for most people. But if you actually read the rest of that speech now, it's very pro-European. I mean, she was arguing passionately in favour of the single market, which she was the driving force behind. So this idea that has grown up, because of her then subsequent opposition to the Maastricht Treaty when John Major was Prime Minister, people assume now that had she still been alive in 2016, she would have voted to leave the EU. Now, I don't know whether she would or not, but my suspicion is she wouldn't have. And most of the people who were around her at the time also think she wouldn't have. So again, that's one of these myths that oh, she was the first Brexiteer. Absolute rubbish. She wasn't at all.
It's really interesting, isn't it, that people talk now about sort of the age of social media politics and the impact that one misplaced or dangerous soundbite can have. And actually, you think about no, or the one you've given there, and actually, maybe it's an instance of that being the case for longer than we would necessarily think. We've skirted around or alluded to a couple of times the idea of a Thatcherite consensus that is carried on through governments of changing political persuasion. I'd invite your comments on that, whether or not that is a product of, I guess, consensus, submission, that, famously, what's your greatest achievement, Tony Blair, this idea that Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, David Cameron, and everyone since, and I would probably push back, I don't think you can say they're all exactly the same, birds of a feather. There are quite important political differences between all of them. But nonetheless, until quite recently, where polling now suggests that actually when it comes to privatisation, when it comes to austerity, that actually there is pretty significant public support public opposition, I should probably say, to those measures. Why do you think it is that her ideas have endured in that way? Because you started off here talking about Attlee, I agree, builds the welfare state. Thatcher, I counter, sells it off. Then you think about maybe Tony Blair gets put in that category.
Well, she didn't sell off the welfare state. See, that's another myth, that she privatised the NHS. Nothing of the sort.
Yeah. I think I'm not talking literally, I'm talking figuratively. I'm talking more about sort of, the privatisation of assets that previously had been nationalised when I speak like that. Blair, however, is he in the same category? He's a pretty transformational politician, and possibly maybe Farage, particularly in terms of Brexit, he might start to get lumped into that category, particularly if he becomes the next Prime Minister. Why is it that you think there wasn't a radical departure under New Labour specifically, away from these Thatcherite ideas?
Because there have been very few original political thinkers since Thatcher's day. I mean, struggling to think of any, which is terrible, whether it's right or left. Who would you think of? I mean, Frank Field, possibly. But he was one of those politicians who would think the unthinkable, but then wasn't able to implement it. When he became a minister, he was hopeless as a minister. And Thatcher wasn't an original thinker. She was a magpie. She stole ideas from think tanks and Keith Joseph and Alfred Sherman and people like that. And that, I think, is the mark of a successful politician, where you can pick things that you think can actually work. I mean, think tanks are great, but they do have a tendency to come up with ideas that no politician could ever think of implementing because they'd be far too controversial. And I think that's where the right is in a problem at the moment, where there are still lots of right-wing think tanks who in many ways do great work, but they're not coming up with ideas for government yet. Now, whether they will or not, I've got no idea. But where are these people? I mean, I always think when people say, oh, well, politicians, they're not as impressive as they used to be, you sound like an old git when you say that, and it's usually because you are. And I think there are some very talented people now in the House of Commons. I mean, since the election, I've interviewed lots of Labour and Tory and Liberal Democrat and Tory new MPs. And virtually all of them, I would say, have been quite impressive. Well, the Liberal Democrats actually all should be Tories. They look like Tories, they sound like Tories, most of their ideas are fairly Tory. Somehow they've ended up in the Liberal Democrats. The Tories have only got 26 newly elected MPs. So, I mean, not a very rich sort of vein to mine in terms of new ideas. So, I mean, it's kind of wimping out of the answer, but I just don't think that we have the political thinkers that there were in the 60s, 70s and 80s.
Yeah, I think, from a left-wing perspective, you think about sort of titans in the Labour movement, you talk about Tony Benn, people would talk about Michael Foot, although, obviously politically, actually probably a pretty strong corollary to Jeremy Corbyn. I think Foot probably more of an intellectual than Corbyn, but politically useless, right? Longest suicide note in history, correctly described.
I remember going to a Michael Foot rally in Norwich when I was a student, and my friend Tim and I, we were the only Tories in this audience of 2,000 people in St Andrew's Hall, and somehow we decided it was a good idea to heckle him. well, it was for him, that was manna from heaven.
Mm.
And he just used these patronising put downs, which were absolutely fantastic. And I interviewed him on his 90th birthday, and I sort of told him that we'd done that. He goes, "Oh, I used to love hecklers." And I said, "Yeah, I remember." He and Tony Benn are the only two people who have ever actually fallen asleep while I've been interviewing them.
I don't know whether that's a sort of remarkable.
Notice I haven't done that with you.
No, absolutely. I'm very grateful, Ian. You know, no, they're like sort of remarkable longevity or a sort of damning indictment of your interviewing style. No, I think it's interesting you say that, because I think, particularly in the union movement now, whether you talk about Mick Lynch, Eddie Dempsey, whoever, and I was just sort of named RMT people there, but the way that politics is conducted within the union movement, it is discursive, it is argumentative, and you see it actually. A couple of times Starmer's been heckled. People have actually made it on stage, which, I mean, outside of the actual very obvious and dangerous security implications of that. But he is robotic. I don't know the right word for it. It doesn't. I can't imagine him saying, you know, I love it. I love getting heckled. You know, or relishing in that sort of that combative, impromptu, improvised. And I think I'm inclined to agree with you. I'm inclined to agree. I think there has been a decrease in the calibre of politician we've got. We're running out of time. Hypothetical young left-winger watching this interview right now and asks you, you know, what should I admire about Margaret Thatcher, if anything? What would you say to them, without trying to convert them, without trying to put, what's something that they should look at her and go, do you know what, I give her that?
That she was capable of changing with the times. I mean, look, she was born into a sort of low middle class household, and she immediately, when she reached adulthood, she decided she wanted to make something of herself. She went to Oxford, which, I mean, for a young girl before the Second World War, just as it broke out, was quite something to do. She got a scholarship and she made the most of it. And to have overcome all of the hurdles that were put in front of her before she became an MP was, again, quite something. She didn't go with the flow all the time. In 1967, she was one of a handful of Conservative MPs to vote for the legalisation of homosexuality, which people often forget when the argument about Section 28 rears its ugly head. She never actually wanted Section 28, but it was one of those things where, as a politician, sometimes you have to give the other side a bit of red meat, and she shouldn't have done it, but she did. She was generally a conviction politician, despite being pragmatic. And I think that voters in general like politicians who they listen to what they say, they watch them, and they think, yeah, they've got something about them. And that they don't just sort of go with the latest trend. And she wanted to achieve something, and she did achieve something. I mean, we haven't talked at all about the Falklands or the Cold War.
Yeah.
But she played an integral role in ending the Cold War and ending communism. Now, you can argue that, well, that hasn't quite turned out how many people would have hoped, but that's not down to her. She identified Gorbachev way before anybody else did as somebody who we should look at cultivating, and then 2 years later he becomes head of the Soviet Union. And it all stems from there. As soon as she met him, she rang up Reagan and said, "You've got to meet this guy." And every time he then met Reagan, he would stop off in Britain to talk to her, to basically get a lowdown on what Reagan was likely to say. So she played an absolutely core role in that. And her staunch opposition to communism, I mean, we think that we're quite near a nuclear war at the moment, but believe me, when I was in my 20s, there was a real danger of that. When the Soviets were deploying SS-20 missiles, the Americans were shipping cruise missiles to this country and to Germany. And there were lots of movies made about what would happen in a nuclear war. And she was able to argue for the nuclear deterrent in a way that very few other people could. So I think if you're looking at why you should think of her as somebody that's worth more study, and not just reading my book, but reading Charles Moore's 3,000 pages on her. I mean, all of these things, I mean, it was a fascinating period in history, and she was an integral part of it in a way that most European leaders weren't.
Yeah, when you're touching that, and I would add on to that as well, the Troubles, which we haven't even spoken about today.
Yeah.
The same way the challenge you faced trying to get it all into a volume of this size.
Well, I wasn't going to do a chapter on Northern Ireland, but it soon became clear that I had to. And she knew nothing about Northern Ireland when she came to power. Absolutely nothing. Well, it was totally opposed to the IRA, as anybody would be, partly because they had killed Airy Neave, her chief. He was the one that effectively made her leader of the Conservative Party. And he was her shadow Northern Ireland secretary, and they murdered him literally, I think, on the first day of the 79 election campaign. And she never forgot or forgave that. But again, the word pragmatism comes back, because she knew that there had to be a settlement at some point. And she came to an agreement with the Irish government under Garret Fitzgerald in 1985, the Anglo-Irish Agreement, without which I would argue the Good Friday Agreement could never have happened. So yes, Tony Blair deserves most of the credit for the Good Friday Agreement, but John Major does too. And I think Margaret Thatcher does as well, even though there were times when her relationship with Charlie Haughey or Garret Fitzgerald, shall we say, weren't as good as they could be.
I mean, it's interesting. I've really enjoyed talking to you about her, and clearly it's someone you hold a lot of respect for, and you're also open to critique, and like I said at the beginning, conscious of her flaws. Final question. I'd invite you to perhaps point out a final myth, maybe even one that I've put forward in this interview that you'd like to challenge me on, or something that more regularly you hear that comes from the left. If people to leave this conversation now, go away, look something up, and try and come away with a different point of view, what's something they should look into? What's something that you think the left gets wrong about Margaret Thatcher?
I think the main thing is her attitude to apartheid in South Africa. Have we talked about this?
We haven't. Not only we spoke about it before we started rolling.
All right. That, I think, is where people get her completely wrong. She, it is true, did refuse to impose sanctions on South Africa. So therefore, if you want to think lazily, you think of that, well, she must have been in favour of apartheid then, because every other country, every other Western country and Commonwealth country did. If you look at the archives and the correspondence between her and the South African government, and then you read the memoirs of Robin Rennick, who was our ambassador in Pretoria at the time, you come away with a very, very different impression. And Nelson Mandela himself thanked her for her role in his release. And if you look at the papers, you look at the records, time after time in meetings and in correspondence, she would call passionately for the release of Mandela, even though she regarded the ANC as a terrorist organisation. Robin Rennick in particular is there's one very funny anecdote when Mandela had been released and he came to London, and Robin Rennick sat Margaret Thatcher down and said, look, he's had however many years it was, 30 years to prepare for the conversation that he's about to have with you. And she said, oh, you mean I shouldn't say very much, Robin, which, as you can imagine, for her was quite something. And he said, yes, Prime Minister. So Mandela comes in and she sits there and listens to him without uttering a word for an hour. And the press waiting outside in Downing Street started chanting, "Free Nelson Mandela." And I think he recognised her role in all of this. And look, I mean, I can remember at the time, even I started thinking, well, maybe there doesn't seem to be any sign of change. Maybe we should sort of follow the crowd and impose sanctions. But she was adamant that that would hurt the very people that the left were thinking they were helping. And she didn't think that it would actually hasten the end of apartheid. So she played a big role behind the scenes in doing just that. And if you read what de Klerk has said about it, he would corroborate that too. So that's one of those sort of lazy, liberal left thinking things where I think, well, oh, she must have been a racist. Far from it.
I hope you don't come away from here thinking that you've been engaging with some lazy liberal left thinking.
No, I don't. I mean, I have to say, I've done doing a lot of interviews on this book, and I've enjoyed this one more than any of the others. So, well, to my mind, this is how political discourse should be. It shouldn't just be, you're a bastard. No, you're an even worse bastard.
I can call you a bastard if you like.
You can call me what you like. But no, I've really enjoyed it.
Me too. Iain, thank you so much. Margaret Thatcher out on Thursday. That's right. All good bookshops, probably the bad ones as well. Iain Dale, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much.
Cheers.